The presidency says it will continue to pay former President Jacob Zuma's legal fees despite a court bid to stop the arrangement. The former president is on trial for fraud and corruption and wants the state to continue paying for his defense. But opposition parties are fiercely opposing this and ask the court to prevent any further payments. However, Ramaphosa's office says its hands are tied because this was an agreement with Zuma that they have to adhere to until a court rules in favor of those opposing the arrangement. Well, joining us in studio to discuss the matter a bit further is Ben Theron, Portfolio Manager at Outer. Joining us via telephone is Nkosencha Chezi, Chairperson of the Radical Economic Transformation Champion. And joining us also is a political analyst, Alvis Masocha, on the phone line. And also on the phone line is Dr. Corne Mulder, the Chief Whip of the Freedom Front Plus in Parliament. A very good evening to you all, and thank you so much for joining us. Let me start with you in studio, Mr. Theron. Just talk to us about Outer's opposition to this agreement that the former President Jacob Zuma had with the presidency to pay his legal fees.
Very simply, the statements made is that the state is covering the fees. The state is not an entity out in mid-air. It is people, normal people, and citizens of Africa that cover those costs. 16 million rand spent on one man that has been ducking and diving for a very long time. He was begging for his day in court. He can now have it, but he absolutely refused to go there.
And just to bring in those that are joining us via telephone line, I'll start with you, Dr. Corne Miller, who is the Chief Whip of the Freedom Front Plus. Good evening to you, and thank you for joining us on Afro Prime Time. Talk to us about your opposition to this agreement.
Well, the fact of the matter is, I understand what is happening here. Mr. Zuma signed or may have an agreement with former President Mbeki while he was still president and he was a deputy president, that the state will pay the legal costs of President Zuma. Now, I can understand that an argument can be put to say that President Zuma, or Deputy President at the time, in certain instances, did certain things in his capacity as Deputy President, and that the state should provide for his legal costs. Now, we can argue about that, but if you look at the reality, we've asked a question to the Minister of Finance in November last year. He didn't respond to us then. I think it was politically not good to respond then. We resubmitted the question in March, and we've received a reply recently in which indicates that between 2009 and now, more than 24 million has been spent on legal costs of President Zuma. Now, it's one thing if you just go to court and you want the thing settled and you are then protected in that matter. But it's quite clear now in the last 9 years that former President Zuma has done everything possible to stay out of court and to frustrate the legal processes, and we've got numerous examples of that. There's no argument and no reason why the taxpayers should fit that kind of bill. President Zuma should fit his own bill in this instance, and we cannot accept for 1 second or 1 cent any longer that taxpayers' money should be wasted in this way to keep former President Zuma out of jail. It's not acceptable.
Now, Nkosencha, let me just bring you in here. Good evening to you. Are you also of the opinion that former President Jacob Zuma should be footing his legal bill?
Good evening, and good evening to the viewers at home. In fact, we are of the opinion. In fact, we just want to welcome, the gesture by the president that the legal fees for President Zuma will be paid by the state. And in fact, that does not necessarily mean that we believe that President Zuma is being, prosecuted justly. We feel that the cases that are brought before him are political motivated, that it has happened before. And we feel that, it is within his rights to be protected and paid for by the state. Because if you understand, the constitution of this country does make an allowance for every individual to be treated, innocent, to be assumed innocent until proven otherwise by the court of law. So any assumption, any claim that President Zuma should pay his own legal bill is misplaced. If you think about what has happened in the past, Magnus Malan, the apartheid villain, was accused of murder. His court battles was paid for by the state. Why should it differ when it comes to President Jacob Zuma? But we know that President Jacob Zuma is headhunted for standing for radical economic transformation and claiming land expropriation without compensation, and therefore he has made himself an enemy of the white monopoly in this country. And the masses of this people of this country will never be fooled by white monopoly capital. We stand 100% behind the people's president.
Well, political analyst Elvis Masocha is also here on the phone line. Good evening to you, Mr. Masocha. Thank you for joining us. Now, some comments there from the previous speaker that some of these allegations against the former president are of a political nature. What is your thought on that?
Firstly, let me pass my humble greetings to you, Gio, and all the viewers.
Thank you, Mr. Masocha.
Most importantly, let me begin by saying, let us not invest too much emotions into an issue that is purely legal. Because, firstly, there is a standing presidential agreement that in lieu of the charges that are leveled against Jacob Zuma, the state will settle those legal fees pending the outcome of such, court process or processes. That is why even in the past 12 years, there's never been any eyebrows raised over that standing presidential agreement between our administration and Mr. Jacob Zuma. But right now we understand that, Zuma has associated himself with so many things that are wrong and terrible with our country. But at the same time, let's try to rise above, unnecessary emotions and focus on this issue within the context of the agreement that is there. The most important question that we need to entertain as South Africans is, does that agreement entered between our government and Mr. Jacob Zuma, could it be located within the bounds of legality or constitutionalism? I think that is the most important question that we need to entertain as South Africans. Because when you listen to so many people commenting on this issue, they are putting too much emotions into it. Zuma has done this and that, forgetting that we are dealing with a situation that is based on an agreement between a state and a person. And the question is there any constitutional or legal basis to that agreement between our government and Mr. Jacob Zuma? So let us not be emotional about it and focus on the legal basis of that.
We'll just come back to you, Mr. Theron. It's mentioned here by the political analysts that this should actually be treated as purely a political situation. I mean, a legal situation rather, not a political situation. Do you think that this kind of agreement is actually based on proper legal principles, constitutional principles, that indeed he should be perceived as innocent until proven guilty?
No, so let's split the issues. You are proven until proven guilty. That's a fact, and we will respect that. Take emotions out of the way, because law does not have emotions in it. What we should be looking at is whether the contract is legal. Because typically what happens with any government department, government official, is that as long as you deal within the confines of your job, the law, the state will then cover your costs in the legal battles that you face. This is not in that case. This is not in that realm. This is doing something outside. He's been accused of corruption. That is not while doing his job. He's doing something other than his job. So hence the dispute comes in whether the state should be covering that cost or not. We believe that we spent in excess, the figure that Connie Mulder quoted now is 24 million. All I can see coming out of the statement of the presidency is more than 16 million. So it's around about 16 million. We spent 16 million rand, taxpayers' money, on defending a man that 10 years ago said, give me my day in court. And every time that somebody wants to put the day down, he finds 20 different reasons not to get there. It's time for him to get to court. Let's prove his innocence so that we can acknowledge that he's innocent or acknowledge that he's guilty. If he's guilty, he should go to jail.
Dr. Mulder, just to bring you in here, I know that we can't really just discuss the accusations against the former president since the case is before the courts. But just speaking about this bill that's actually on the table, do you think that it's likely that President Zuma would win the court case? Is he likely to lose it? What is the strength in your argument to have the courts actually rule that the presidency should stop paying for President Zuma's bills?
Well, if I may react in this way, I understand that there's an agreement between former President Mbeki and Mr. Zuma that certain legal costs will be paid. I understand that, but if you look at what happened in the last 9 years, it's quite clear that there's a pattern from President Zuma's side to try and avoid the legal consequences. And it's not a question of trump-up charges against him. Let me give you one or two examples. There was a case against President Zuma brought by the NPA to obtain a search warrant to search for certain documents and the offices of Tint and to get some documents from Mauritius, which Mr. Zuma opposed. He lost that case, but it cost the taxpayers 15.3 million rand. Then was a second case when Mr. Zuma tried to question the Public Protector's report on Nkandla. He lost that case. It cost the taxpayers 3.2 million. There was the case where he opposed on the Public Protector's report on state capture. He lost that case, another 2.5 million, and so I can go basically on. Quite clearly, we cannot expect the taxpayer to stand in for this one after the other. Now we come to this latest case, and absolutely, he's been charged on 16 accounts of racketeering and whatever all those charges are. There's no way that the taxpayers can foot that bill. He did not do those things in his capacity as president. The charges against him is that he's been enriched on a personal level and that he had certain benefits in that instance. There's no way. Now, I understand from the president's office at the moment that they say they honor the agreement reached, but they will abide by the court's decision. So there's currently a court application to have that agreement set aside. So all the president's office is basically doing is say, until the court directs us and says what the decision is, we will abide to the original agreement. But I'm convinced that the court will set that agreement aside because there's no way there. I don't see any legal basis where the state should foot the bill under these circumstances. It's impossible.
So, Mr. Theron, do you also agree that the court will likely actually set this agreement aside?
I just want to preface what I'm about to say by saying the following. A contract between two people or two parties does not supersede the law. The law supersedes that. So we cannot have an illegal contract. So what they have asked the court to do is to in fact check the validity and the legality of the contract. We believe it must be set aside. We hope it will be set aside purely from a point of view that, number one, in the context of doing his work, the president is protected under law and the state will cover his cost. This is outside the ambit of that. And as Dr. Mulder has just indicated, a number of cases that cost us millions of rand, he actually lost. And even if you look at the contract, he should have repaid the money because it was always dependent on the outcome of the court case.
Now, Nkosana, let's just also bring you back into the conversation here. How likely do you think it is that the court will set aside this agreement and President Jacob Zuma, former President Jacob Zuma, will actually be required to pay the legal fees of all of the past litigations to date?
Look, it would be unprecedented of me to predict what the court will say or will not say. But I just want to comment on what your learned friends have alluded to here, to say that President Jacob Zuma is in court for the things that he did in his personal capacity. You see, right there, you have someone who has violated the Constitution because it presumes everyone to be innocent until proven guilty. So for any individual to claim that President Jacob Zuma is in court for something that he did in his personal capacity, it assumes that he has already been found to have transgressed the law, of which it is not the case. And secondly, we are not being emotional, but however, the historical background upon which President Zuma and the country comes from is emotional because we are coming from a dispensation where African people, black in particular, were oppressed. And what is happening today, we see the perpetuation of the white supremacy through the court system itself and the charges that are being leveled against President Jacob Zuma. And I am still reiterating the fact that President Jacob Zuma is in court, going to courts these days for proclaiming free tertiary education to the children of the working class, for standing for radical economic transformation, of which we know it simply means that the white monopoly capital will have to let go of some of the privileges that they enjoy. We want land expropriation without compensation, and that will mean that the 80% that the whites are owning in this country will have to be shared by the people of this country. And for that, President Jacob Zuma is being persecuted.
Well, Mr. Masoko, do you agree with Nkosana that former President Jacob Zuma's constitutional rights are being violated by people wanting him to actually pay his own legal fees?
Firstly, let me clarify a sentiment that has been expressed among our fellow panelists. That it is extremely premature or even irrational for anyone to declare a guilty verdict or a not guilty verdict against Jacob Zuma. Because remember, at this point in time, he still has to appear and face those charges that are leveled against him. So to me, it will be very much irrational to support or be against whatever charges that are leveled against him. But as an analyst, let me focus on the gist and core of arguments here. Firstly, we need to agree, Kio, that even our constitution is very silent with regard to what must happen to a former president or a former premier or a former minister who is now facing a possibility of appearing in court should the state fill those bills. Unfortunately, our constitution is very silent. Even our broader legislations are very silent with regard to that. That's why even the Thabo Mbeki administration realized that the laws generally are silent on that. Hence, they are entering into an agreement with Mr. Jacob Zuma. Given that, because if a law is silent, then why would you want to punish somebody when the law is silent? To me, it doesn't make sense to argue that the government is wasting money for footing Jacob Zuma's bill while the laws are silent with regard to that. But thankfully, maybe this case might even reach the highest echelons of our judiciary, the Constitutional Court, so that it can declare this loophole or lacuna that is persisting to say what must happen to former public office bearers who are appearing in court. Should their former employer, I'm referring to government, foot their bill or not? I think that is a situation that we must acknowledge, that our silence and our constitution is very silent with regard to that matter.
Well, you know, just coming back to you, if the court actually sets aside this agreement, do you think that the former president has the capacity to pay these bills, to foot the bills?
No, very simply. If you look at what happened immediately after the announcement that the presidency will not pay, immediately his lawyers disappeared. Now probably they will come back because there's an opportunity to do this. Mm-hmm. His legal representative has been at his side for a long while, and I'm quite sure there are a few million rand made out of this. I just want to remind everybody that, number one, they have to remember that normal citizens like you and I don't have the luxury this man has. Under no circumstances will we get 16 to 24 million rand to cover our legal costs. This is unheard of. It's unacceptable.
Well, just your closing comments as well on the way forward.
We've got to wait for the court case. Hopefully it will bring clarity. The political commentator just said, maybe this will reach the Constitutional Court. With unlimited funds, Jacob Zuma can drag this out for another 10 years. We hope that is not the case. We hope he has his day in court as he requested, and we hope that justice will, at the end of the day, get to be seen. Mm-hmm.
Well, Dr. Mulder, can I have your closing comments?
Yes, please. No, I don't think there's a legal lacuna in this whole situation. It's quite clear to me in terms of the law. If a member of the executive does something in terms of what is expected in terms of his department and he takes a decision, then he is charged or being taken to court. The state should pay because he exercised an executive decision. That's something else. Here we are talking about a criminal charge against a person in his personal capacity for doing certain things wrong. Whether he's going to be guilty or not, we don't know. I just want to react and to say that to make all those accusations about white privilege and all those kind of things, it's completely the wrong debate. It's not on the table, and it's cheap political points that I think take us nowhere. I would like to know, if President Zuma is found guilty, do they then accept that he's got to repay those costs?
Well, Nkosensha, your closing comments.
Thank you very much. In closing, I just want to say it is correct to raise the issues around the presidents of President Jacob Zuma. You must remember that he was only an MEC of Economic Development and Tourism in KwaZulu-Natal when the arms deal was concluded. And in fact, President Mbeki, who was the then state president at the time, came out just recently to say that there was never an arms deal. And therefore, it is for that reason that South Africans should just wake up and smell the coffee President Jacob Zuma is being targeted for standing for black people's emancipation in this country. Only 7% of the land in this country is owned by black people. The rest of the land is owned by white monopoly capital, and that must come to an end.
Get away from the
As people of this country, we 100% stand behind President Jacob Zuma.
It's a cost of legal fees, not these other emotional discussions.
Well, just in closing then, also Mr. Alvis Masocha.
Hello?
Yes, Mr. Masocha, can you give us your closing comments, please?
Oh, thanks. The last year to say, Kyo, that let's invest our faith and confidence in the judiciary to provide clarity, to shed some light with regard to this paradox, because it's an extremely complicated, situation. I don't think there's any amount of commentary or analysis that can clarify this, but maybe our courts can clarify as to what should happen with regard to a government footing the bill of a person who is no longer part of government. Let's just play wait and see game.
Well, indeed, we should wait and see, and we will. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining us this evening. That was Mr. Ben Theron, a portfolio manager at Outer, Nkosen Chashezi, chairperson of the Radical Economic Transformation Champion, political analyst Alvis Masocha, as well as Dr. Corne Mulder, the chief whip of the Freedom Front Plus in Parliament. It is time now for a short break. We're back at the top of the hour with your Afro Business.